Order, order, and welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee in our first evidence session in science and Scotland. And we have a quad of professors to help us, and all female professors too, which is, I think, it's the first time we've had that in the Scottish Affairs Committee. So you are more than welcome. What we'll do is we'll allow you to introduce yourself. If you've got anything by way of a short introductory statement, tell us a little bit about what you do, what your institution is, and that will just help us for our record. And we'll start with you, Professor Boswell.
Thank you very much. I'm Professor Christina Boswell. I'm Vice Principal for Research and Enterprise at the University of Edinburgh, but today I'm here in the capacity of representing Universities Scotland.
Great.
Hello, I'm Julie Fitzpatrick, and today I'm representing the Royal Society of Edinburgh, our National Academy.
Thank you.
And I'm Maggie Gill, and I'm representing the Scottish Science Advisory Council, which is an independent body that gives advice to the Scottish Government.
Thank you.
And my name is Mette. I'm a social anthropologist at University of St Andrews, and I'm here today representing the Alliances for Research Challenges, which is a new initiative funded by the Scottish Funding Council.
And thank you all ever so much for such concise introductory statements. This is all new to us, so you'll forgive us if we're not quite up to speed and you get asked some daft questions. And if they do seem particularly daft, please tell us, then we'll know in the future to get it right next time. But this is mainly an introductory session, so we're really interested, just in the generalities of quite a number of the issues that we're looking at. Well, hopefully, as the course of this inquiry continues, we'll be looking at them a little bit more in depth. So I'm going to start off with probably one of the most basic things that we could ask when it comes to science in Scotland, is that we're unique historically and reputationally as a centre for science because of the Enlightenment and all the fantastic inventions that we've seen throughout the centuries. Is this a reputation that is still deserved? And we'll start with you, Professor Boswell, with that one.
Thanks very much. Absolutely, it is deserved. So science in Scotland and research in Scotland is an absolute powerhouse for Scotland, punches well above its weight, is a real asset and a driver of innovation, economic growth. So while Scotland comprises 8.2% of the UK population, it comprises 11.4% of its researchers measured by the Return to the Last Research Excellence Framework. So, proportionately a very high number of researchers, and those researchers are producing outstanding research. So again, based on the last REF of 2021, 85% of the research that was submitted was judged to be world-leading or internationally excellent. And not least, that leverages huge return on investment. So for every pound of money invested by Scottish Government, we see a return of £8 in terms of benefits to the UK economy. So it's a huge asset to Scotland, and we are rightly very proud of it.
And I'm grateful to you because that'll be the first part of our evidence sessions when it comes to the securing of evidence for this particular inquiry. So thank you for that. I'll go right across to Dr. High in your views. Are we still worthy of this reputation that we've acquired over the decades and centuries?
Definitely. I work in the space of kind of energy, climate change, net zero. And one of the things that we do extremely well in Scotland is to collaborate. Researchers collaborating with industry, business, government, and local communities. And there's so many initiatives that are happening, and it's really driving forward the agenda on net zero. So I'm very pleased with what I'm seeing.
I'm not going to ask the other two professors, just because I think you're pretty much going to agree with most of what you've heard from your colleagues. What I'm going to ask you instead, and you could take a bit of time to think about this, because we just wonder, is it up to date? Have we maintained this excellence? Have we still managed to be worthy of our reputation throughout these decades? And I'm going to ask you if you could give us an example of Scottish scientific excellence in the last 5 years, which particularly stands out for you. And we'll maybe see if Professor Fitzpatrick could give us an example of something along those lines.
I certainly think that we have maintained our excellence in science, and many of our impacts have had international impact and are highly relevant. Christina already mentioned about the Research Excellence Framework, And there were many case studies there, about 750 case studies in total, which gave examples of some of the amazing science that we're undertaking within Scotland. We've got some excellent examples right across renewable energy, drug discovery, life sciences, health sciences, agri-tech and food production in Scotland. So many of these were represented both in the research outputs in REF, but also in the impact case studies, which were defined by that. Many of the universities also collaborated with our institutes across Scotland, contributing again to the international impact of the work that we conduct. So although there's an impact locally within Scotland, there's international impact as well.
Thank you. And lastly, on this question, Professor Gill, excellence still deserved example perhaps in the last 5 years?
Yes. The example that we put in our submission, well, we put two examples, and the first one definitely on health data. And Scotland has excellence in that area and access to, although that was not straightforward during COVID, but it led to a world-leading paper in terms of the analysis of people with COVID. The second example that we gave was in physics, and I think this is something that my colleagues have also, we sort of come from different areas, and I think Scotland has a lot of expertise across a wide range of sciences. But I think something else perhaps to take into account is that science is changing as over the years in terms of being much more about teamwork than individual scientists. You know, we still have Nobel laureates in science, but they tend to be recognising that there are teams that are working in it. And I think that's a key thing for Scotland, is to still be able to have access to work with the best elsewhere. So our second example was a previous CSA, actually, in Scotland, who had collaborated in the area. This is outside my area of expertise, but laser interferometer gravitational wave observations, if anyone knows what. But basically, the point, it's not the detail of that so much as some of these things will be transformational. You know, like we've seen a lot in the press about artificial intelligence, and some of these have risks with them as well as opportunities. And often as scientists, we're sort of really keen and enthusiastic in our areas. And I think the broader collaboration, and as we've heard about it being more interdisciplinary as well, and so bringing in physics, social science, things together, then I think Scotland is good. We like to think we're networkers, and we like collaborating, and I think that's looking forward, which as scientists we do.
There's a few words that's already started to emerge. I'm sure my colleagues have heard it, like teamwork, and the main one is collaboration, which seems to be coming out loud and clear just about the nature of the environment we find ourselves in for looking at science in Scotland. And my next question is, so what are the opportunities available for scientists in Scotland to develop their work and ensure their work has the most world impact? Is it this collaboration that you're talking about? I'll come to you, Professor Boswell, with that one.
So I think there are absolutely opportunities, and we're seizing those opportunities across a number of areas, whether it's through collaboration, industry engagement, other areas of innovation. So I think a number of universities in Scotland have really ramped up their industry engagement and commercialisation activities, for example, and that's been hugely beneficial. But I do think let's grasp the nettle here. There is a funding challenge. Considerable funding challenge. So only about 83% of our research is actually funded through the dual funding system, which is the core grant and grant funding. And that means that we have to cross-subsidise research through other means, and mainly through international student income. And as you know, that challenge is particularly pronounced in Scotland because of the differential in the income we get from students. And there are a number of other impediments and ways in which perhaps it's not a level playing field with the rest of England. So absolutely fantastic opportunities, but some real challenges over funding, which I hope we can unpack a bit in this session.
We are most definitely going to do that. I'm going to stick just now on some of the background, and going to come to you, Dr. High, and all this. It's just what opportunities and what do Scottish scientists need in order to ensure that their work is taken to this new world audience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we are encountering is a challenge where a lot of funding opportunities come with a very short, compressed time horizon. So there will be calls, and will be coming from UKRI, for example, so it's UK-wide funding. We will have a call, we build our teams, we put in applications, and we're being asked to deliver very, very soon after we are being told if we are lucky to win the awards. And that very compressed time horizon, I think, affects our ability to deliver. So for scientists, if it was possible to have a slightly longer time horizon, we would be able to deliver so much more on the pound.
The funding issues come up a couple of times now, so I'm going to address this directly, because we asked for evidence. We've got loads of evidence. We're very grateful to everybody who submitted what has been really, really helpful stuff to this inquiry. But funding, of course, is one of the key things that we've dealt with. And I don't know about colleagues around the rest of the committee, but I've looked at some of the funding arrangements, the infrastructure for support and resourcing. It's Byzantine. It's really, really difficult to understand about who gets what, how that's done, what works with what. I mean, you mentioned some of the devolution aspects of all this and the comparisons with the rest of the UK. Just give me your views about like the funding infrastructure and environment that you work on. And don't go into in depth because we're going to come to them specifically, but just generally, what do you feel about where you are? And Professor Boswell, you brought it up first, so perhaps you could help us with that.
Yeah, that's right. So I think one of the issues is the disparities, and I mentioned the cross-subsidisation challenge, but there's also the challenge that there are a number of pockets of funding which we simply don't have access to in Scotland. One of those is a sort of much more substantial innovation funding in England as compared to Scotland. So just to use the example I'm most familiar with, Edinburgh University would be receiving £5 million a year if it were based in England for innovation, whereas it receives 1.7 million being based in Scotland. Similar disparity around some of the funding for biomedical research, where the NIHR in England quite generously funds biomedical research centres not available in Scotland. Again, a university on the scale of Edinburgh or Glasgow is probably missing around 25 million a year. So these are huge disparities, and the problem is this doesn't just affect our core research funding, it also affects our ability to leverage external funding. So in the absence of core funding, we're less competitive for UKRI grants, and we have less capacity to build the infrastructure to support commercialisation and industry engagement. And we also, and this is the risk coming up on the horizon, we may well be less competitive in the next REF, the next Research Excellence Framework, because we haven't received the same kind of funding for research culture, but also the same level of core grants. So I think there's a real risk of a downward spiral and a real threat to this position, this status, and again this powerhouse of Scottish higher education research in Scotland, that we might be in risk of having that eroded.
And is that the experience of your colleagues who are sitting to your left? Is Professor Gill?
If I could come in terms of the institutes in Scotland, because Scotland also has a history of endowments from various people in terms of setting up institutes, particularly in agriculture, which is my background area. And over the years, there has been a move from those being funded. At one point, they were funded within government, and now they've been sort of moved further out from government. And so they don't get the dual funding system that universities actually get, but they only get the 80% funding, which UKRI actually gives. And they also have trouble in terms of accessing some of the funding for infrastructure. And that, again, I think they are a very important part, the institutes, of the Scottish research landscape. And so they're even more challenged, I think, in terms of some of those funding limits, trying to keep a smallish, like keeping a small business going without having access to all the funding sources.
We want to capture that, hear more about some of these specific and distinct issues, but I'm just generally interested just now in the the funding infrastructure, the place where we find ourselves. We've not heard from you, Professor Fitzpatrick, just your observations about how you operate, and is it roughly the same experience as Professor Boswell?
Yes, really, from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, we would agree very much with that. The sustained real term cuts in public funding since about 2014 and 15, and that has caused a disproportionate reliance on international students to cross-subsidise operating costs, undergraduate teaching and research activity. And that has an impact on particularly about the competitive disadvantage that Scotland has when it comes to large consortia grants. Many of the sources of funding at the moment are looking at big science and big teams, and where there's a requirement for matched funding, that puts Scotland at a disadvantage. And Scotland has had a declining share of UKRI funding over the last few years.
Could you just explain a little bit to the committee what the difficulties with the match funding is, just so we understand fully what the problem is here?
Yes, very often when certain research calls will offer up grants of X amount, but there's a requirement for the universities either to match that funding or to make up the difference between the value of the grant and the full economic cost of conducting the grant. So very few funding sources give 100% of full economic costs. Okay. Charities give very little, sometimes none, but very little. Other sources of funding have differing levels of full economic costing. So if it's a matched funding situation, or the universities or institutes have to help to co-invest, that does put us at a disadvantage.
You understand that?
It will also happen for other UK universities and organisations as well. It's not a specific Scottish issue.
And we're going to get into a lot more of all this, and thank you for those fascinating initial responses to this inquiry. But I'm going to hand over to Mark Menzies, who's got further questions on something.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Professor Boswell, if I could just return to some of the things you were saying a few minutes ago and just explore that a bit more. You talked about big sums of money. We use the example of Glasgow and Edinburgh, where there was that research funding shortfall. And the UK government has said it wants to raise domestic public investment in research and development outside of the Greater South East of England by at least 40% by 2030. So what needs to be done to ensure that Scotland gets that adequate share? How do we bridge that gap and actually get to that target that the UK government has set?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that we really have to do. So one is, there's a particular source of UKRI funding where we see a real pronounced disparity in what's coming to Scotland, and that's Innovate UK. And that's a very important and growing source of funding, especially for translational and commercialisation type activity. Now, Scotland only receives 5.9% of Innovate UK funding, which is really disproportionate given our 11.4% of researchers in the UK. Now, we have engaged with Innovate UK, University of Scotland has engaged with Innovate UK to make the point that the kinds of mechanisms through which research is funded or innovation is funded are not based on or don't fit the business model that we see in Scotland, which is predominantly predominantly SME based. And so for SMEs, they have limited absorption capacity for R&D and to engage in the types of mechanisms iUK offers. So we really think there has to be more focus on what really works for different regions in the UK if we're going to ensure that this 40% target is met. A couple of other things just meant to mention very briefly. Really good models of that kind of regional investment can be seen in the city deals. So we have a number of very successful city deals where Scottish and UK government have worked together really constructively to prioritise strategic investment in particular areas of Scotland. And we've also seen obviously the investment zones recently in Glasgow City and the northeast of Scotland. That's another very good model. And finally, I should just mention that obviously Scottish Government produced a great national innovation strategy quite recently, a couple of months ago. And in that they set out a plan for a Scottish investment fund, which would help leverage investment into spin-outs in Scotland, especially deep tech spin-outs, which require a particular type of investment. So I think that would really help to bring R&D investment into Scotland, but as yet we're not quite sure how or whether there will be funding behind that initiative.
Just on that, that list of things you just reeled out, sort of city deals and so on and so forth, on its own, will they help to bridge that gap, so to take it up to the UK average? Or is that just, are these just the vehicles where money can go in, or will those structures, so the city deals and the investment zones and so on, do they bring money with it as part of that deal, which in turn would then get you to that UK average number?
They do bring money, but that leverages significantly more investment than is put in by government. So I think we have to keep remembering it's, you get a lot of bang for your buck if you invest in research and innovation in our universities.
Yeah. And just sticking to a similar theme, I mean, Professor Fitzpatrick, in your reply to the Chair's question at the beginning, you reeled off a list of sectors, where Scotland, from research and development, was doing rather well. Thinking again of that question of how does Scotland get to, or how do we reach that UK government's target of getting the 40% by 2030? Is it within those sectors, or are there new sectors that we have to try and bring forward?
I mean, there are multiple sectors, and I think that does reflect Scotland's amazing, scientific excellence. But there are new sectors such as satellites, space. Again, many different types of renewable energies, hydrogen, for example, carbon capture and storage in terms of net zero, and so on. So there's many sectors which are doing incredibly well. And one of the possibilities looking forward is to try and create sovereign wealth funds. So, for example, from the offshore wind sector, capital could be generated there that then could be reinvested into better businesses. Completely agree with Christina about the need to attract private investment to make up this type of income that we need. And it is a challenge because we don't have the same large multinational companies in Scotland as there are in south of the border, but nonetheless much can be done to try and maintain that. We need to be clearer from the UK government about the levelling up funding and how we can make sure that that comes to Scotland wherever relevant, and agree about the city deals and the investment zones. So lots of things happening there, but we definitely need to not just have private investment, but have our research outputs that are translated into spin-out companies. We need those then to be scaled up. Scotland has a lot of spin-out companies and a lot of intellectual property, and quite often it moves out of Scotland. It's either bought over by companies in the UK or the States, for example. Lots of different countries will buy into our technology. They'll also attract our scientists to move to other parts of the country. So we need to be better at tech scaling up technical companies, and there are some initiatives in Scotland that are trying to do exactly that, but it requires private investment as well as public.
Sorry, thank you very much. Professor Boswell, you mentioned that for every pound invested in research would generate £8 for the wider economy. But to take Professor Patrick's point there, that actually we were able to develop things so far, and then they may get bought over, or the opportunity moves out with Scotland, but often overseas. If we were to able to, take away the barriers that prevent that development further, what do you think that number could look like? Could it be 1 in 8? Could it be 1 in 10? 1 in 20? What is there any work been done to look at what that true value would be if we were to able to get the support for universities and SMEs? Bob on.
I mean, I wouldn't want to give a figure on that, but I mean, I think we could look at, for example, the innovation powerhouses in the Golden Triangle, look at what Oxford's done, what Cambridge has done, and I think we should think about our ambition in relation to those sorts of successes. So, for example, Oxford invested in innovation about 2 decades ago, I think, and sees incredible return now and huge levels of investment in its spin-outs. So it's a huge success story, and we need to emulate that in some of our universities in Scotland.
Right. And to both Professor Gill and Dr. High, and once they reply, please anyone else join in. Are the barriers which could be removed by the UK or the Scottish Government to enable the Scottish research and development sector to flourish further?
Yes, and removing the barriers is very much, I think, how this should be looked at. It's how do one put it? There are barriers, there are some opportunities through being a smaller country in terms of shorter lines of communication and people maybe interacting more, for example, with policymakers, with industry. It's easier to make those communications. So the barriers are more, as has already been said, in terms of on the finance side and having more of a level playing field in terms of getting access, and this lack of headquarters of large companies actually, but you can understand why they wouldn't, why they would want to be in the south of England and creating more of a critical mass there. So it's hard to see how you could persuade industry to change what it's actually doing. And Scotland has a very important input into supply chains. And I think it's another point about the world. I mentioned earlier about how science is changing and becoming more collaborative. I think all the complexities of life with having to deal with multiple challenges at the same time are very... So I think, as my colleagues have said.
I mean, from my experience, a lot of it is also about how do we retain the best talent in Scotland. Higher education is an international sector, and we have researchers, right, who are traveling from one country to the next. And at the moment, the UK as a whole, and Scotland in particular, I think for higher education is not the strongest prospect. And that's the reality. That's where we're at. And we have great talent who are leaving our country, right? And it's really sad to see. Some of it has to do with decreasing wages in real terms over the last 20 years. That's the reality of higher education. Another issue is, it might sound really petty, but it's real, the very high visa costs. If we have great researchers coming internationally to the UK, we are asking them to pay very, very high fees and to have money in the bank just in case something happens, and we need to pay extra for the NHS. And that's an upfront cost that you're asking a researcher to pay to move to the UK. If something could be done to make the UK a more attractive workplace, that would be great. We are working in a space where some of our competitors internationally offer tax incentives to researchers, wanting to attract the very best of the labour force. And here, we don't. Instead, we put up fees. It makes it difficult for us to compete.
Sorry, Professor Boswell, or Professor Fitzpatrick, anything else you want to add?
Yes, I would agree with that. There are some figures, research conducted by the Institute for Management Development's World Competitive Centre, and it ranked the UK just 29th out of 63 countries as a favourable destination for international professionals. That's the lowest ranking over the past 5 years, and a drop of 7 places since 2021. And you know, it is very much around the stagnating salaries, present cost of living, and so there's much that we need to do again to lift that international reputation. And it's obviously been very difficult with COVID-19 and with the UK's exit from EU, which has probably had an impact on the perception, certainly, of some international scientists about the UK, and that's something that the Royal Society feels we need to very much focus on to make sure our world standing is recognised widely.
Professor Boswell?
I mean, I would agree with everything that's been said. I would simply add that this also links to the issue that we were discussing earlier about funding. So if Scotland begins to be seen as a place where you're not going to have access to state-of-the-art labs and equipment and facilities, where you're not going to be competitive for large grants and so on, then it becomes less attractive vis-a-vis England as well as other European and international countries. And then, of course, as we know, then you risk a kind of self-perpetuating brain drain type effect. So there is a risk that could happen, yes.
Just a final question, Chair, just very briefly. Professor Fitzpatrick, you talked about, again, going back to your list of sectors where we're doing well in research. From our initial reading, we seem to be doing very well in terms of space in Scotland, particularly satellites. How can we? Why have we done so well in that particular sector compared to others?
Yes, it is interesting. I suppose, like most sectors that expand and do really well, it's based on really good scientists doing really good basic research that then expands out to become strategic research and commercially viable research. Sometimes that research is done within Scotland, and sometimes scientists move into Scotland to do that work. And I think in the satellite and space area, there's a combination of those who've come into Scotland because we have literally the space, pardon the pun, we have the geographical, the spatial awareness and capacity to have launch sites and space initiatives, but we also have the support of the academics themselves. And then again, for those examples, it is very much trying to make sure that we attract very large amounts of capital infrastructure money to be able to furnish that. But it's not just capital equipment in terms of buildings or equipment, some of which is very expensive. We then need to make sure that we also draw down the money to pay the salaries for the scientists to conduct that work, because all science is actually quite people hungry. It's an area of work that does require people in order to deliver it.
Thank you. Gerald, I'll hang up my boots.
Well, thank you and you will know that we're concurrently doing an inquiry just now into the space sector in Scotland, so anything you could do to help us with that would be gratefully accepted. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. Can I go back to the funding issue, because I think it will come up a number of times today. Professor Boswell, if you're not getting sufficient funds from government, your other source of income is through students. How is the current situation in terms of income for universities in Scotland with regards to students? How would you describe that?
So obviously our universities are absolutely built around our students, and they're so hugely important to us, and we really welcome having a balance of obviously Scottish domiciled students, rest of UK and international, and we want to get that balance right. At the moment, Scottish domiciled students, of course, are funded at £7,000 per student. Fees from English students are £9,250. Now, even that higher level of English fees doesn't cover the costs on average of teaching and learning for students on a university degree in a Scottish university. So that means that all of our UK students, and especially our Scottish domiciled students, need to be cross-subsidised, and we do that through international student recruitment. Now, in some ways, that's an end in itself. It's beneficial to have diversity and a mix of students coming from different backgrounds and perspectives on our courses, but we want to ensure we have the right balance and that it benefits everybody on those courses, including our UK and Scottish students. So obviously there are challenges in the fact that we do depend on international students for cross-subsidisation, not just of research, but also cross-subsidisation of the costs of teaching. So I think that if that addresses your question.
I was going to ask, do you think we have the right balance at the moment? Because my colleague in Holyrood, Liam Kerr, was speaking this week about the fact that we now have 3 times as many international students studying in Scotland as we did when the SNP came to power, and I believe this year will be the first time ever that income from international students is actually going to be more for Scottish universities than the grant that they get from the Scottish Government. Yeah. Is that balanced?
Obviously it varies across universities. I don't want to comment on that balance because it goes out with really my role here in the committee today. I'm covering research for University Scotland, but obviously it's something that we need to look at, and we need to think about the funding model and the sustainability of that model for Scotland and for the UK more generally.
and I don't want to press you too much on it just now if you're not comfortable with that, but it's maybe something University of Scotland could write back to us about, because it will actually have an impact in terms of what is available for research and other things done by universities if that balance isn't correct and something has to be changed. So would it be okay to one of your colleagues perhaps?
I can certainly pass that on, and I agree with you that it's an important question.
Note of that. We'll get back to you.
Thank you. Professor Gill, in your evidence to the committee, you said the UK faces productivity challenges due to low research and development intensity and the need for better alignment of research funding with government strategies. What can be done both with Scottish Government, UK Government? Do you feel there's not enough engagement before these strategies are developed and announced, or could there be more done once the strategies are announced but not potentially put into practice? What were you getting at with that evidence?
So what we're getting at is that perhaps there's a lack of understanding of the impact of devolution of having in some areas, obviously in the devolved areas, that there is a bit of a conflict between a bill that might be being enacted in England and there's a different approach being taken in Scotland, and that some of the funding mechanisms don't always recognise that difference. And so there's a feeling amongst some scientists in some areas that perhaps the research councils and within some of the departments in UK government, that there isn't that recognition of the specific nature of Scottish, the way some of the Scottish bills are diverging from the way that it's being undertaken at UK level. Now, in some research councils, so I'm sure you've taken in the evidence already that the Engineering and Physics Research Council has actually put in place regional representatives. I met one actually recently at a meeting that Dr. High and I had organised, and that there was someone who is based in Ayr who is specifically there to try and make sure that there is that understanding. Other research councils, I'm involved with the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, and perhaps because there has long been a recognition that farming in Scotland is very different from farming in England, then there is a big effort by that research council to reach out and have people on their strategy advisory panels that understand, that can represent the Scottish viewpoint. But it is not across the board, was the point we were trying to make.
Although on that latter point, farming within Scotland is very different in different parts of Scotland. So it depends where your experts come from, I suppose, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think in Scotland that's increasingly recognised about a diversity, because our geography is so varied with islands and highlands and the central belt, then there perhaps has been more opportunity to learn what that diversity means for policies.
Mm-hmm. Professor Fitzpatrick, I was wondering the Royal Society's view in terms of when we spoke last week about space, and my colleague Mark Menzies has already touched on that, and we've brought it up repeatedly, in terms of space being attractive for particularly female candidates to go into. We heard what I thought was quite stark evidence that actually in one of the courses initially it was 50-50 male-female, but 10 years on there's a huge attrition rate.
Yeah.
Have you done any research into that in terms of science in particular, the attrition rate of people, particularly women, maybe studying but then not taking it on in a career, and what we can do, what we can maybe recommend to try and stem that rate of attrition?
It wasn't an area that was specifically discussed with the response to this consultation, but it's a subject that's discussed extensively at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, because there is a recognition that there is still a lack of diversity in STEM subjects, and it's not just space, it's science, technology, engineering and maths, and it is an issue. The attrition rate is obviously one aspect of that, because obviously there needs to be constant looking at why that might be happening and how we try to reverse that. Much of that is attracting women at a later stage to come either to start in science or to come back into science. But there's also the aspirations of young people or the lack of aspirations of young people to take up STEM subjects. So these are areas that are discussed regularly at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but not specifically with this call in mind.
Your panel's doing a very good job to offset that today with a full female panel. Dr. High, can I come on to you? And actually I was looking back at a paper that you'd written with a Dr. Smith called The Ethical Constitution of Energy Dilemmas.
Yeah,
yes.
please.
Well, I was very interested. You noted in there calls to hasten a transition to less carbon intensive forms of energy, all too often cast fossil fuels and people whose work and lives bring them into being as immoral. Now, obviously, we have a very strong footprint with oil and gas in the North Sea and in the northeast of Scotland, where I represent, and indeed across Scotland. 90,000 jobs rely on that. These are often high-skilled jobs. What do you think the current situation in terms of politically, with obviously the Scottish Government being against further exploration of fossil fuels, how does that match with what you were writing in this paper?
Yeah, I mean, the politicisation, right, of the energy sector and the people who work in that sector is as intense as ever. Mm-hmm. And I think we see it very much in the decisions that have been made from Westminster in relation to Scottish commitment to climate targets. We are going to see the development of Rosebank offshore, and that is a decision that's coming from Westminster at the same time as the Scottish Government is maintaining its net zero commitment. So it's very, very political, and I think it's extremely important that we recognise that the individuals who are working in energy industries are not bad people for needing a job and for putting food on the table. We need to have discussions about the targets, the commitments, the direction, the visions, the ambitions, rather than casting individuals as bad people.
You wrote that back in 2019. Do you think it's got worse since then?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you quantify that?
No, but I would happily take on the challenge and think more about it, definitely.
I mean, is there a danger if there's this repeated narrative that anything to do with oil and gas is a bad thing, is negative? It has an impact on encouraging, whatever people's views, there is still, many decades of work in the North Sea in these highly skilled jobs. Yeah. Is there a risk that the narrative around that, as you say, some people saying it's immoral, that puts people off and puts young people who could learn skills in that trade and then transfer to perhaps green energy in the future? We could be, by the action of some, putting people off getting into this industry.
I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Just like being in politics then, eh? Thank you for that. Christine Jarman wanted to come in. Christine.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to come back on something. I think it was Professor Boswell touched on about science being quite people hungry, and the balance of students having changed over the past few years when Douglas Ross mentioned it. I should mention, I have an interest to declare, I used to teach in the university sector at several universities, and I took 3 or 4 years out and was astonished when I came back at the shift in the number of foreign students. It wasn't a science course, but the shift in the number of foreign students because of this need to cross-subsidise with foreign students. But that reminded me of something Dr. High had said earlier on about the need for international students and how expensive it is for international students to come here, get visas, to stay and work. So do you feel, any of you on the panel, that there is a conflict and a tension between this increasing dependency in Scottish education on foreign students and the money that they can bring into the system and the expense for them of coming to Scotland? Do we have to find some way of reconciling that?
Anybody?
Dr. High, since you raised it.
Yeah, well, so I'm at University of St Andrews, and at St Andrews this discussion has come up actually more in relation to the carbon footprint of the university, where the university has a commitment as well to become net zero, and it's 5 years ahead of the Scottish Government's target. And we've talked about, scope 3 emissions. We have international students. They are travelling across the world to come to Scotland. what do we do about our Scope 3 emissions as an institution? So international students, from my point of view, they sit in a very difficult space because we need them for their money. We need them when it comes to the research for their skills and capacities and networks, everything that they bring. But there are also expenses that come with it, environmentally and financially.
And do you think, any of you, or would you say, perhaps I'm over worrying about it, that we have become too dependent in Scottish universities for financial reasons on international students, which then creates further tension with the cost, the environmental damage? And do we need to re-examine whether our universities, we need to move away, we need to find a way of moving away from this, some would say, over-dependence on foreign students?
If I can come in here, I mean, I think there are risks of over-dependence on particular countries as a source of international students, and I think we have to look into that and make sure that we have the right diversification. But I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we don't welcome and value international students. They're an essential part of our very international, outward-looking universities, and they're also a really important pipeline to attracting the very best international scientists. And I'll just give one example from the University of Edinburgh, which of course I'm most familiar with, where 45% of our early career researchers are from countries outside of the UK, and that's because they're the best people for the job. So I really want to reinforce that point, that we are international, we're outward looking, we're cosmopolitan, and we would want to stay that way.
I wasn't meaning to suggest that you're not, but what I was saying was there are problems which are being created because of the need for international students, the dependence on the finance for international students. There are tensions and conflicts being created for the universities that perhaps need to be examined.
I agree that, and I think as we'd said before in the discussion with Mr. Ross, I think we do, of course, and we are, the sector is examining those dependencies, and in particular, risks to the sustainability of our business model, really, in the HEI sector if we're dependent on particular groups of international students. But again, I wouldn't want to necessarily comment beyond that.
No. One of the other things, and this is, if you like, a sensitive question. We've talked a lot about the lack of students in STEM subjects, and the lack of Scottish students in STEM subjects is one of the other problems about the need to bring in international students and the funding for international students, contributing to a disincentive to Scottish students to study STEM subjects and go to Scottish universities.
No, I don't think it quite works like that, because there's a certain quota of Scottish domiciled students which Scottish Government funds, and so there isn't a direct competition.
What I mean is, should we need a quota? I mean, what I'm saying is, do we need to re-examine whether or not there are conflicts being created by the current dependency, which might ultimately be unhealthy and need to be reassessed?
I think there is a sort of piece today where I think the CAP is being re-examined and looked at over again, as it constantly has been in the course of 3 years. Well, we believe that just now, because I think it's important questions, and I'm sure we're going to come back to a number of these when we go through this inquiry. But I just want to ask about spin-outs, because I think it was you, Professor Boswell, or perhaps Professor Fitzpatrick, that brought this up. And I was quite intrigued to find out that spin-outs is such a big feature of the science community and the commercialisation of a lot of your research. And again, I think I noted that Scotland was a leader in spin-outs from higher education institutions, and a lot of this is predicated because of the intellectual property generated by the HIE, and also how this is then made into some sort of production. Would that be the right term to use in bringing it to market? Could one of you maybe just help us? I think it was maybe new evidence, Professor Boswell, so I'll come to you first, just about exactly how this works, why we've made such a thing about this in Scottish universities, and what more we might need to do in order to ensure we get that commercialisation of the research through the use of the IP.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason we've...
Just before you do, I've just seen that we've been joined by Mr. Alan Brown, who is a first-time attender at this committee, and we're delighted to have Alan on this committee. And I just have to pause proceedings just to ask Alan if there's anything that he needs to declare to this committee over and above what is included in his register of members' interests.
Nothing to declare, and apologies I'm late. As you know, I had travel nightmare today in the West Coast, but nothing to declare.
Indeed, I've been getting a constant update from Mr Brown all the way down to the West Coast mainland, so thank you for that.
I was clean shaven when I left this morning.
Sorry, Professor Boswell, you were just getting into your stride.
Indeed. I think the benefits of that kind of activity are huge. So if we've got brilliant intellectual property coming out of our research, we want to make sure that its benefits, broader benefits, are maximised, that we can take our insights, our services, our products to market. So that's why we support spin-outs in our universities. And many of our academics are very enthusiastic and really want to see their research adopted. I think we've had particular successes in the life sciences and things like, drug discovery, where we've got some fantastic success stories on spin-outs. Now, of course, that does take quite a lot of infrastructure and support within our universities, because the types of knowledge and expertise you need to set up and attract investment and so on for a spin-out is considerable. So we need to set up technology transfer offices, we need legal teams, we need people to analyse the market, we need to attract investment and so on. So I suppose the point I would make is, for the larger universities, for some of our universities, we have made immense progress in that direction. For others, it's expensive. We would benefit from a higher level of funding to support those sorts of activities. So I would just go back to maybe those 2 points I made earlier about the need for a Scottish investment fund, which would support investment, bring in capital to support those sorts of spin-outs, but also the inequity in the innovation funding that we secure in Scotland as opposed to England. So that would really support that activity of setting up a successful spin-outs.
Loudly and clearly, but I'm just interested in the spin-out feature, because it does seem to be an important part of the operations within Scottish universities and the commercialisation of the research. And I'm seeing Dr. Hyde nodding there. And could you just maybe just sort of, I don't know, just tell us exactly how important this is for research in Scotland, and what part it plays in the general infrastructure?
So with the Alliances for Research Challenges, for example, that's why I was nodding, because it really resonates with what we are doing in that space. The Alliances for Research Challenges is essentially about bringing all the universities in Scotland together across all disciplines, arts, humanities, social and natural sciences, all of us working together. And it's not just academics working together, it is precisely with industry and business. And that's where we are seeing a lot of spin-out activity, and with government and with community organizations. It's really a cross-sector initiative. And each alliance is centered around a particular challenge. So one is on quantum technologies, another one is on brain health, a third is on food systems, and ours is on energy and sustainability. And by having that focused attention on a particular societal challenge that's a key priority for the Scottish Government, it's very focused, then we have that really broad stakeholder engagement, bringing everyone together. We can already now see, and we can hear from the ones that are bringing research into commercialization, that's the environment that they need. They need that funding that is so important, and it's difficult to access it. But we have the right environment when it comes to the intellectual capacity.
We're going to have to move on. It's a big panel. You've got lots to say, which we're all very much enjoying, but there's quite a number of colleagues being in. And I'm interested in the monetisation of intellectual property in this particular sphere. I share the all-party intellectual property group, so maybe I'll explore that a little bit further with you guys at some other point. But we'll move on and we'll hand over to Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Chair. We're very good at setting up businesses and not very good at growing them, I think it's fair to say, which we need to be better at. I'm going to ask some questions about the recently established Advanced Research and Invention Agency. So I will start with you, Dr. High. Whether you think the scientific community in Scotland has had adequate input into the development of ARIA.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As we also mentioned in our submission, ARIA has a very particular conceptualization of transformational science. And we feel with this, in the alliances, as a strategic initiative to bring together multiple stakeholders, that ARIA is perhaps too narrow. And it could benefit from a much broader conceptualization of how do we address complex challenges. Complex challenges will require complex teams, complex skill sets, complex methodologies. And it would be great if ARIA could widen its scope a little bit more.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Gill.
I attended a webinar that was organised by the team from ARIA that brought together a lot of Scottish academics. I think there was a general feeling that we were not somehow being kept in the loop in terms of ARIA. I think it has taken quite a long time to gestate in that, to a point where now they have actually appointed these programme managers, and one of whom is going to be based in Glasgow. I do hope that what will happen is that they don't. It's a nice concept that you give a lot more freedom, and it certainly worked within the American research environment in terms of actually achieving a mission, a particular mission, but particularly in a defence area. I think they very definitely need to keep talking to other academics, because they're at one part of the spectrum of science that goes through from discovery all the way down to what we've been talking a lot about in terms of missions, and as Dr. High said, in terms of the meeting the big research challenges. And I do hope that they don't feel that they are part of a wider landscape of research and not going too far on their own, that there is engagement with the broader academic sector.
Okay, thank you. Professor Fitzpatrick.
Yes, the Royal Society definitely welcomes ARIA's mission, particularly its diversity or its contribution to greater diversity of research funders across the UK. And we feel that ARIA will broaden the opportunities for researchers and enhance the viability of more speculative research. In other words, scientists know that much science or much research doesn't deliver exactly what it's anticipated to do. And so there's a sort of antipathy against risk, whereas ARIA is going to be high risk, high reward, potentially high reward. And I think that RSE thinks that will yield considerable benefits for society. And of course, it's based on the ARPA or the DARPA model from the United States, where indeed there were some fantastic outputs from that. So RSE has appreciated the engagement that we've had so far from ARIA, but we'd like it to be regular and perhaps slightly more inclusive, not just including universities as the deliverers of research and development, but institutes and wider academic organisations as well.
Okay. And Professor Boswell.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with what's been said. I mean, we very much welcome the potential for more flexible approaches, the experimentation with different models, but of course there can be a trade-off between that kind of flexibility and light touch approach and making sure you have the right kind of transparency and rigour in your processes. So I think it's all about getting that balance right, and I think there are some risks around inclusivity, especially in relation to some of those issues about regional spread and meeting the 40% target and so on. So I think we need to keep watching that space and being vigilant and ensuring that we have that open approach.
Thank you. I mean, just taking up on the regional spread, bearing in mind that the benefits of ARIA's funding are not restricted to a single location, but they're across the UK. Do you think there's anything specific, starting with you, Professor Boswell, that you'd like ARIA to do in terms of geographic funding? Where do you think some of that funding could be concentrated?
So I think, as you're intimating, ARIA's mission isn't to ensure levelling up goals are achieved and so on, but I know that the CEO, Ilan Gur, is personally he's very open to these discussions and is very much aware that this is a priority for for UK government. So I think there is that openness to those discussions. I think you probably can't fix it in a top-down way by giving sort of setting quotas for regional allocations and so on. But I think at the very least you can make sure that you are inclusive and have good regional representation in the way you engage researchers across the field in the programmes, in the wider community of peer reviewers involved in the process and so on. And I think it was mentioned that we do have, of the 6 UK-based programme directors that were recently appointed, 1 is from Glasgow, 1 is from Newcastle, but 4 are from the Golden Triangle. I think it's 2 from UCL and 2 from Cambridge. So it's not quite as diverse as we would like to see, but we have made this point to Elan Gur, but we have to continue, as I say, being vigilant and making sure that we have that openness and representation.
Thank you. And Professor Fitzpatrick, is there anything you can add?
I don't really have very much to add from the Royal Society's point of view, apart from it's really important that some of our fundamental research, our basic research, is fed into what the opportunities might be through ARIA funding, because some of the science that we undertake has potential for disruptive technologies, quantum computing being one of them, artificial intelligence being another. So, as long as we feed in some of Scotland's science excellence to the opportunities, we feel that that's going to be covered well by the programme managers.
Okay, and Professor Gill, any particular...
I don't think I have anything to add to what's been said, because I don't have a clear view. The programme managers have not long been appointed, and what was clear in the webinar was that they would not just be, if you look at their disciplinary backgrounds or where they've come from, I think it was made clear that they would not be expected necessarily to stick to their own areas in terms of the programmes that they develop. And it is good, as others have said, that there is a different funding model. We can always learn, I think, from a range of funding models as to see what works specifically. So provided there is sufficient exchange with the people in University of Scotland, and as Professor Fitzpatrick has said, in relation to the institutes as well, because the institutes have been on the sort of mission side, and I think ARIA, while there's a lot of freedom there, it is about, a bit like the alliances, it's about solving challenges. It's not just about doing science for the sake of doing science.
Thank you. Just a last question, and I'll start with you, Dr. High, is in what ways do you expect ARIA to be able to support Scotland's science sector?
An issue that was raised within our leadership team was there was a real hope that ARIA's funding, since it sits within the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, that ARIA's funding is not going to affect UKRI's funding, since they sit in the same department, sponsored by the same department. As long as that doesn't happen, and we have more flexible funding pots, it seems like a great opportunity, especially if it would broaden its scope.
Okay, and do any of our professors have anything they would add to that question? Professor Gill.
One thing I would add is that I hope it gives inspiration to early career researchers, and I think increasingly the research councils are recognising the need to bring on early career researchers, give them opportunities earlier. So I do hope that ARIA does consider the opportunities there, and I do hope that for early career researchers who are, how could one put it, they haven't, we all change during our careers and we see where limits are and we follow different career paths. I hope that it provides an alternative for people whose brains, whose approach to science are very imaginative and innovative, and I hope from that point of view that it provides that opportunity.
So just to explore that a bit further, is that a lot of people who are amazing at research and inventing stuff might not necessarily be the best people to go on and develop a business. And so is the ARIA something, do you think, that can help with that, or do we need something extra in order to help that development of an invention into creating a market and letting market forces do their bit?
I think it's about, science now is about having teams of people. As I said earlier, you cannot find, the challenges are complicated. We need people in science who go into depth in a particular discipline. We can't do without that. We need people who can work across disciplines. We need the people who can take it into the industry. Yeah. And I think we're still struggling to find how to create and recognise teams, and that everyone has a place within that, and the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And it is not that somebody who is good at scaling up is the one that makes all the money, and the one who has the imaginative ideas sort of gets left out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Professor Fitzpatrick.
Yes, just to add to that, I mean, I think if ARIA is successful, there will be that sort of travelator, that translation from the disruptive technologies into the business development models, and of course into what we hope will be major investment by private companies, because that's what's happened in some of our competitor countries across the world. There's really substantial investment because private companies will want to invest in some of these disruptive technologies to answer the global challenges, the good of society, the environmental challenges that we have. So I see ARIA as really attempting to pump prime, to do that travelator all the way through to companies of scale and international impact in a diverse and different model to our, I don't want to call them more traditional, but our other funding opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Wendy Chamberlain, you've got a couple of questions and you're just going to ask
them both together.
If that's all right,
yes.
Please.
Thank you very much. So my first question, and thank you very much all for being here today, is in relation to the Research Excellence Framework. And my first is probably just for my own understanding. So obviously the REF is managed via Research England, and the team who do it are via Research England. I see there's a joint steering group, but I just want to understand, how do you all input into the REF? Is it into the Scottish Government, or is it via the Scottish Funding Council? I just appreciate an understanding of how that input is actually given, and open to anybody who wants to fill in the gap for me.
Can I ask for a clarification? Do you mean how we input into the structure and sort of framework for the REF, or how we input our own
views,
research?
Views as in terms of to ensure that the REF actually properly reflects the value of the work that is happening in Scotland?
Yes, so there are a number of channels for that. So one of them is obviously the FRAP, when it reported, has issued a consultation process, and we are feeding in as University Scotland, FRSE and so on, and individual universities are feeding into that. Now, the scope of that consultation has been relatively limited, and as you're probably aware, there have been quite a lot of noises across the sector about their frustration about that. So now we're being asked for broader comments around some of the proposals about beefing up the people, culture and environment section in particular, so the research culture element. So that's one way, through consultation. Another way is that universities are represented on the Scottish Funding Council's RCEC, Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee, and SFC, of course, is part of discussions on this. And we also, as universities, have panel members who act as assessors in the REF, and they're often part of the discussion about what will work and how feasible are different ways of implementing the REF and so on. So there are a number of challenges. Having said that, I think it wouldn't be amiss to point to some frustration, as I said, in the sector, that perhaps some of the proposals have not been properly road tested with universities to ensure that they really are feasible and implementable. And also, as with any complex organisation, and universities are quite complex organisations, whether there might be inadvertent or unintended consequences of certain of the changes within universities, and also in terms of the reputation across the sector.
That's very helpful, and I suppose one demonstrates the number of challenges, but also the different channels as well. And certainly, obviously, Ref 21, you said it yourself, 85% of research from Scottish universities was assessed as world leading. So it suggests in many ways the current Ref was meeting, or at least giving you the opportunity to put forward the shop window. But certainly in the evidence, and if I can come to you, Dr. High, the Alliances for Research Challenges talked about the subject-based assessment, I understand, from evidence so far. So can we share some of those frustrations about where we are with Ref 28?
With pleasure. The Ref 2021 and now with FREP, it remains a very traditional approach to higher education. It's organized according to disciplines. They're trying to recognize the interface that is super exciting and where a lot of exploratory work is happening through interdisciplinarity, and interdisciplinarity can be raised in the people culture. What's it called? People,
culture and environment.
People, culture and environment section. But when it comes to how do we submit our work, it's organized according to disciplines. When it comes to how is it being reviewed, it is being reviewed according to disciplines. It sets benchmarks according to disciplines. So it's a very siloed approach that reflects very well how research was done decades ago. Mm-hmm. It does not reflect very well how research is done today, especially in Scotland.
Yes, because
so it puts Scotland at a disadvantage, yes. I would say.
And I suppose the question then that leads from that is research and science has developed not only within Scotland but across the UK and globally. So who actually benefits from continuing to assess in such a discipline-based way? Professor Gill, can I ask you about that?
I'm much less involved with the Ref than the others are here.
Yes.
So the only comment I would just back up what Dr. High was saying about the traditional and the history, because I was involved before it became the Ref when it was something called the RAE at that point in time, and it really does need to keep moving with the science and make sure that it is judging. And you know, again, it comes back to, so often there's a lot of discussion amongst scientists about what is the best science or what is good science. There's lots of different ways of defining what that best is. Is it about the academic excellence? Is it about that impact? And it's a little bit about everything. And how do you have one system that covers such a wide range of size of institutions? Because we have big universities and smaller ones. How does it cover all the different missions of institutes as well? So I'll just stop at
absolutely, and having the right emphasis at the right time. Professor Fitzpatrick, your thoughts?
Yes, the Royal Society of Edinburgh has submitted their view on the Ref, and so there is a paper that describes that. Royal Society is obviously a national academy and it's a research funder, it's not a research provider. So the responses from the Royal Society very much look at the kind of cross-sector issues, and I think the general feeling is that we feel the movement and direction is good because it's about more inclusivity and more diversity. Royal Society's mission is knowledge made useful, and so the impact agenda is particularly important to the Royal Society. But I'd like to just say, you know, Scotland we're quite a small country, we're quite well connected, interdisciplinary interdisciplinarity is one of our features, and so it would be nice to see a ref design that takes into account more of that type of approach. And I think more work needs to be done, particularly on the impact area, about how we really try to judge what that means.
So it sounds like it's still a work in progress. Is that fair to say, or is it more? Is it set more? I mean, I can see the Scottish Funding Council said in its evidence that it's got a significant influence. But if we're feeling that there's elements of it that aren't necessarily meeting Scotland's needs, is that accurate then? So you screwed up your face, Professor Boswell.
Inadvertently. I'm not sure that this is a particular Scotland issue. Okay. I think it's a UK-wide issue, and some of the concerns that we've been articulating, and I think the two main concerns actually that universities have raised in response. I mean, I think the point about interdisciplinarity is very well taken, but I think it's very difficult to conceive of a viable structure for actually, creating interdisciplinary panels. Lots of ideas have been mooted, but it's very difficult to see how you would put that into practice. Yes. I think the two key issues where I think there's been some concern is around the raised weighting of the PCE dimension, so essentially the research culture dimension, from 15 to 25% in one go. And I think the sense is from University Scotland is that we welcome the increased importance attached to research culture, which is absolutely fundamental, but we do feel that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in order for us to operationalise that, and let alone measure research culture across our universities. And I think, if I may just very quickly, I think the second key issue is around the so-called decoupling of researchers from their output. So a proposal that, unlike in 2021, not every researcher needs to submit an output. You can imagine that could have implications for equality, diversity and inclusivity, as universities may not feel they need to provide equal research support for everybody, because not everybody has to be submitted. So I think those are the key concerns, and I think, to be fair, they're probably shared UK-wide rather than just Scotland.
Dr. High, you said that potentially Scotland being put at a disadvantage, and based on the evidence I've heard this afternoon, I might have got this completely wrong, but it is part of that reason why Scotland might be put in advantages. The outputs of the REF are actually potentially more critical for Scotland, given the sort of fewer funding pots that there are available, given the description of the funding that was available in England, is how well Scotland performs, or Scottish universities and institutions perform in the REF, actually potentially has a bigger impact on what funding outcomes might be successful.
One of my other hats is as Director of Research at St Andrews, and looking into how much money a university like St Andrews is getting based on its REF performance. I was surprised that it wasn't more.
Okay.
The amount of time and money and energy that goes into the REF, it's just staggering. And then we are fighting over what is, in the big scheme of things, not as much money as you would have thought.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would favour a streamlining of the system, a simplification. Maybe we could think about submissions at an institution level, no discipline level, no department level, but an institution. And maybe we could think about averaging it according to members of staff, full-time equivalents, so that we can still think about the different scales that we have in Scotland and elsewhere. It's just an idea to try to get away from this very discipline-specific focus that we're working with.
But those do sound like they are UK-wide issues. Thank you very much. Can I move on to my second question, which was about UK RI, and indeed we did do a bit of work in our universities in Scotland inquiry on that, and indeed we had made a recommendation that somebody from the Scottish Funding Council potentially sat in the UK RI Executive Committee. But what we were told by the UK Government was that the appointments are made on a personal experience and skill set rather than specific people with sort of geographical responsibility. But on that, and sort of suppose revisiting it, how effective is the system UKI are using to distribute funding, and do we feel that Scotland is getting its fair share? Professor Fitzpatrick, if I can come to you on that.
Yes, from the Royal Society of Edinburgh's perspective, I think there's good links with UKRI, and the Chief Executive and Board have visited the Royal Society on a number of occasions recently. So they do take their strategy and themselves on road shows and go around at the devolved administrations, the 4 nations of the UK. And I think they do that to make sure that there is a high level of engagement. Obviously, people always want more, and the Royal Society would say that it would be good to have even greater interaction with UKRI, particularly discussing Scottish research priorities, the areas that we're particularly good at now or want to become particularly good at. And one of the suggestions was to have perhaps an office based here in Scotland where UKRI representatives would be based, and that would make the interactions even closer.
Okay. Would you agree with that, Professor Boswell?
I would agree with that. I would also just point out that we have seen a relative decline in the proportion of UKRI funding coming to Scottish universities from a bit over 15% to roughly 13%.
And what do we think the reasons for that are? Is there that, again, back to my sort of last point, is the possibility that there's not other funding pots for Scottish universities to get means that it's more difficult to make bids for UKRI funding?
I think that's spot on. So I think that the type of investment that you need to be competitive for the larger, more complex grants really relies on some core funding, which helps you to leverage your attractiveness in those sorts of bids. So I think that has a knock-on effect.
That's interesting, because again, that came out in the science inquiry session that we had last week as well. Okay. My other question, and if, before I conclude, is to Professor Gill. You mentioned earlier about research councils. And the work that some research councils are doing. From a UKRI perspective, is there more that you think different research councils could be doing?
I think, as I referred to earlier, the different research councils are taking slightly different routes of things that they're changing, like the engineering and physical sciences having...
Could UKRI be giving more direction, do you think? Would that be helpful?
I think they could perhaps learn more internally between the different councils. I mean, those of us who've been involved in mergers of institutions, which to some extent UKRI is, know that it takes quite a long time. Each research council had understandably, a slightly different culture, because they're coming from different bits of science, and their communities that they're serving with the funding are also different in nature. So we're all progressing with this, recognising the need for interdisciplinarity, and trying, what could be really good would be to take the best bits from the different research councils, and that perhaps needs a bit more direction.
Yeah, from the centre.
I think the Chief Executive's doing a good job, and it is a large organisation with a very large budget, and therefore what can we reasonably expect to achieve in the time that it has actually been operational. So I would prefer to sort of describe it as each research council probably has a good bit of how they're changing. If we could actually merge all of those and have all the research councils using those good bits, that might be a way forward.
And surely you would think that would be in UKRI's interest, because then that means that the budget it has is being spent most appropriately, whichever sector or discipline it's in.
I think there's good signs of progress. But
yeah, lovely. Thank you. Any final thoughts?
We'll have to leave them. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious that I want to get the session finished by 5 to relieve all of you and get you back to Scotland. And so that leaves, there's 3 members still to participate: Christine Jardine, Anna Kaiser and Alan Brown. So half an hour, 10 minutes each, would that be sufficient, we're thinking? Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to move a wee bit away from universities to independent research organisations. One of the points that's been made to us in an independent review was that applying for grants and specific research funding is really designed with universities in mind, which puts independent research organisations potentially at a disadvantage. And people at Cancer Research have said that the value of institutes which sit separately from universities can't be overestimated. So I wonder, do you think there are any funding gaps affecting independent research organisations? Now, you did touch on this earlier in your introduction. So what support could the UK government be offering to overcome that specific barrier for independent research organisations?
As a representative for University Scotland, this for somebody else to answer.
Yes, I mean, the institutes or the independent research organisations are clearly an important part of the Scottish ecosystem, and their equivalents across the UK are an important part of the UK ecosystem, and they are not judged by the REF, so that's one of the major differences. And it's understandable because they have a different funding source, but I think it probably results in a slight underestimation of the impact of the institutes. We mentioned before that they often appear in the case studies from universities, and that's through collaboration. So institutes and universities in Scotland, I think, collaborate particularly well. So there's probably a relative underestimate of the impact of the institute sector, and I think that's the case both within Scotland and at the UK. But there's an increased focus on that because it is increasingly recognised as being important to the whole future of science within Scotland and beyond. I think that's all I would say.
Professor Gill, would you like to add anything?
Yes, if I could come in and just make the point that you're quite right. I think that the UK, the funding, like UKRI funding, is assuming that there is the dual funding model and different, but because the institutes were, if you go back in time, they were set up by independent philanthropists in different ways, and therefore I don't think you can look at all the institutes as necessarily being the same. Some have more potential income opportunities than others just by the way in which they are. You know, you can compare something like environment with something that is in an area where there is more likely to be industry industry investment. I think a key thing would be for UKRI to fully recognise the differences in the different organisations. And even so, one organisation, SAMS, the Scottish Association of Marine Sciences, which is key to the aquaculture industry, which is important, is a different model from other institutes, for example, within Scotland. So I think recognising that diversity would be step one, and UKRI recognising what the consequences of that diversity in funding models. This is not just in terms of the topics that they would be a good starting point from that. I would also say that there's a diversity beyond just the institutes. I think we've heard about the alliances from Dr. High. There are also these other models like innovation centres, which were initially funded by the Scottish Funding Council, and there are also leadership groups. There are a lot of small organisations, each of which has a specific niche in terms of delivery, and some of which are really appreciated by I've heard people from UKRI sort of saying that we wish we had something like this. We also have centres of expertise, which are at that interface between science and policy, which are funded by the Scottish Government. But I think they're all small amounts of funding. I think, as we discussed earlier, they're trying to leverage additional funding, whereas Professor Boswell mentioned the biomedical centres earlier, which have a much more substantial, longer-term funding, and somehow, I'm not sure, I don't think, I've been through in my career, multiple different versions of institutes, and we have no time. We have 6 years before 2030, and we need to do something serious about climate change. We don't have time to look at changing models, I don't think. That's not what I'm arguing for here. I'm arguing for really trying to support the ones that are in critical parts of as Professor Fitzpatrick called it, the ecosystem of research. And perhaps the first point is to map that out as to which are the critical ones, and then make sure that they are supported, even if it means a bit more variety in funding models.
So we should be, just to check and pick it, we should be focusing slightly differently on where the funding needs to be, we should be looking at these critical areas rather than remodelling and redrawing the structure.
Yes, I think just making sure that the functions. I've gone off institutional structures as a way of actually delivery. I would say, what are the functions that are needed? And then there's enough people in all these institutions that can tell you the best way of achieving that.
Did anyone else want to add anything to that? No. Now, we've discussed a lot about comparisons between Scotland and England. They've been a key theme throughout our evidence. As part of devolution, Scotland's able to decide how to spend any Barnett consequentials, and the Scottish Government don't have to follow what the UK Government says. But what effect do you think the differences between the levels of funding for research and development in Scotland and England, and we've touched on this already, are having on the scientific community? Professor Boswell, do you want to? Or Professor Fitzpatrick, which one?
I mean, I can kick off, and I think reiterating some of the earlier points about obviously having a lower level of core funding has a knock-on effect in a number of ways in terms of what we can leverage from UKRI funding, how we can support commercialisation activity, and how well we do in, for example, the Research Excellence Framework. So I think those have a number of knock-on effects. We also mentioned that risk of not being able to attract top talent internationally, so that's another of the knock-on effects. So I think there are real risks here. And I would say, I mean, maybe I don't really want to get drawn into the complexities of Barnett consequentials. Therein lies the path to madness. But I mean, I would say that what we would appreciate in the sector, I think, is stability. In knowing what funding is coming down the road, having multi-year settlements for funding, and really having funding at a level that matches what we see south of the border, because otherwise we really will see a relative decline in Scottish research.
Yes, I would just echo the same, really, to say that budgets are tight everywhere. Flat cash in Scotland at the moment is certainly challenging, and it's put pressures on certain elements of research providers. I'd also just like to mention, though, that again we mentioned it earlier about the kind of deficit of devolution capability across the UK, and perhaps trying to understand having a better perspective on issues that are devolved to Scotland versus retained reserve powers within the UK, just so that we have an opportunity to talk about priorities and specific Scottish systems that need to be taken into account.
So Gill?
I think the issue of talent is key, and again, just the cost as we move to much more complex advances in technology, which are now there, and a lot of the equipment that is required for delivery on those is really expensive, and sharing that between different organisations, I think it is key to attract the top talent in that sense. And I'll stop there.
And does that take us back actually to your point, Dr. High, about the cost of coming here? Attracting talent is vital, but the cost of coming to this country and being a researcher here and getting a visa and being able to stay, do we have to look at that as well as part of the whole implication?
I think so. I think it's crucial. We are a sector of people at the end of the day, and if we don't have the people, we don't have the sector.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Keyser.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for joining us today, panel. So for the science sector in Scotland to flourish, it needs to attract the best scientists and researchers to study and work in Scotland. It's something you've all alluded to. So what more can be done to ensure that Scotland's science sector is more attractive for students, researchers and academics? I'll start with Dr. Hannah first.
What more can be done? Apart from, the dream world where money is endless and we don't have to worry about those issues, something else that could be done, I think, is to really recognise the diversity that we have in Scotland when it comes to research active institutions and then the business landscape. we got on this topic earlier about how Scotland is very, very good at creating spin-outs and SMEs, but, once they get of a certain size, they do move away. We don't have a lot of large industries in Scotland in the private sector. And we've talked about earlier, with some of these grant calls, it puts us, I think, at a disadvantage because we don't have the capacity to be competitive for the very large grants. And they often end up in that golden triangle. So if there was more diversity, both in the kinds of funding that is being provided, I think also in the funding models, personally, I think it could be very exciting to see large grants with multiple principal investigators where we can co-host big grants. At the moment, it's a landscape of competition, but we work as collaborators very much, I would say, in Scotland. And so there's a tension there between collaboration and competition. And if that could be better aligned, I think we'll be better off.
Thank you. Professor Boswell.
Yeah, so we mentioned some of the obvious, very tangible barriers like fees. For example, if you're a researcher coming in on a global talent visa with a spouse and 2 children, you're going to pay over £20,000 up front for 5 years of visa and health surcharge and so on. So that's incredibly expensive. And I think, I could actually quote the Minister for Science, Research and Innovation, who recently said the UK will not become a global superpower behind a visa wall. So I think that's acknowledged in UK government that there's a real tension, and I think we were discussing that earlier. So that's a really tangible thing that really could change. I think international funding is crucial here, and I'm going to inject a note of positivity here into this otherwise gloomy discussion. And so, of course, we were absolutely delighted about the decision to associate to Horizon Europe, and that's been hugely important for Scottish universities in really nurturing those sorts of international collaborations and attracting top talent. For example, through the European Research Council schemes, which are really the gold standard in transformative research and have a reputation across the world for really being attractive funding. So I think that's all very good. I think it's very important as well to continue to convey very positive, welcoming messages, so that kind of symbolic aspect of this. And I think Scottish Government has been good at sort of, for example, conveying the message to EU nationals that they're welcome to come to and to stay in Scotland. I think on the funding side, one thing I would say though is that Scotland benefited enormously from the Global Challenge research funding, so the ODA related funding, which was injected into the system over a period of about 5 years and then was halted quite rapidly, and that was really quite devastating for a number of research projects, for our international ties and so on. I know there's a review currently underway about ODA related funding, but anything you can do to try to use your influence to encourage a revival of that kind of funding, because I think the replacements we're seeing at the moment simply don't quite meet the ambitions of that previous funding, which really nurtured that kind of interdisciplinary and cross-national collaboration.
Thank you. The James Hutton Institute know the challenges around the cost of visas and fees for our international staff. I've spoken about that in great length. In Cancer Research UK state that there's high administrative burden with the UK immigration system. So quite simply, does the immigration system that's reserved to the UK government work for or against attracting the best researchers to Scotland? Professor Fitzpatrick?
This isn't a question that we directly considered from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, so I think we've already described most of the challenges. I definitely agree, though, that the immigration status has to make sure that we can attract the best scientists from across the world, and that means stable funding. It means funding for visas, which can obviously be sometimes covered by the universities or the institutes themselves, and opportunities to gain international funding. That's why access to Horizon Europe and hopefully further opportunities through the ODA monies or the equivalent is really important. So the immigration system is very important, and I think there have been positive moves in benefiting people coming to Scotland recently on the visa system.
Does anybody else like to add anything to that before I hand back?
Yes, just to pick up on the GCRF, the Global Challenge Research Fund, and bring in something perhaps which we haven't talked a lot about, which is the timelines of funding, and the fact that where we're dealing with some of these long-term challenges like climate change, and you're trying to look at adaptation. Now, government funding with the spending review cycle, etc., of course, makes it exceedingly difficult to fund and to give that continuity. I think something that you've heard come across is the need for a bit more certainty. And one of the things about the Global Challenge Research Fund, which I was actually, I have a bit of a background in international development, and I was involved in the early days of it, and it's the fluctuations. So I think this the sort of certainty, the looking ahead. We know that by 2030, sorry to repeat this, but I say at every meeting I go to with science, we only have 6 years and a couple of months left in order to meet some of the things that are being said internationally that we have to do. So the less disruption that there is to the scientists who are beavering away, and as we've heard, have got excellent skills in relation to this, the better. And the more long-term within, of course, all the issues of government financing, but innovative ways of finding how we can give some of that more certainty and allow some of that longer-term research would be to be funded with continuity would be really welcome. And the UK as a whole, but Scotland too, we have had long-term farms that have been owned, for example, by these institutions like the James Hutton Institute and we know the management way back over decades. And are we making enough use of some of that information? And when we were looking at how the James Hutton would change, it was previously funded by the Scottish Government, then one of the issues was to have a particular pot of funding that was to maintain national capability, such as the soil survey of Scotland. I know you don't want to go into detail, but just to basically sort of say this long-term looking into how could we come up with something innovative about the long-term funding which we need if we're going to understand the peat bogs and what's happening and the diversity of the peat bogs. I'll stop there.
And being the MP with the Hutton Institute within it, I've heard lots and lots from Colin Campbell on that soil survey, so thank you for that. Lastly, Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Just continuing that international outlook and just to discuss Horizon, but first of all, just looking at the impact post-Brexit leaving Horizon did before the recent agreement was reached. Now, University of Scotland had said, amongst other things, that the delay to associating to Horizon Europe has a significant negative impact in terms of funding, applications and attraction and retention of research talent. So, Professor Boswell, I just wonder if you could elaborate on potential missed funding opportunities, where it's actually meant in terms of attracting talent and possibly losing talent over that period.
Yes, I mean, it had a particularly significant negative impact on what we call Pillar 2, which is the collaborative part of the programme. Obviously, the UK couldn't lead on collaborative grants, and any money it did receive as a partner was underwritten by UK government, so they weren't directly receiving EU funding. And I think there was a lot of misperception and also anxiety amongst European partners about having a UK partner on board, and also some confusion amongst researchers about what they could and couldn't apply for and whether a UK partner would be seen as beneficial. Now, laid over that again now is the impact of COVID and restrictions on travel between 2020 and 2022. So I think the concern is that we've actually arguably seen a lost generation of early and mid-career researchers who had confusing and limited access to Horizon Europe collaborative funding, and who also were restricted in their ability to travel and to foster those sorts of European partnerships. So that creates a real risk and a loss, actually, to the richness of our international research, which we are hastily scrambling to rectify. So University Scotland is actually in the process of consulting with universities across Scotland to explore what mechanisms they're putting in place to try to revitalise and reactivate those sorts of collaborations and think about how Universities Scotland can support that. I would say that by contrast, the activity on what we call the mono-beneficiary schemes, so the sort of the individual fellowship type schemes, actually held up surprisingly well. So I think we haven't seen such a hit there, although there were concerns about people moving away from the UK because they couldn't access that funding. But I think it's really the Pillar 2 that's the challenge.
Okay, but you said lost generation there, which is quite a damning comment, really. So what needs to be done, and what support's needed to actually, reinvigorate and get that support and get that, enhance the talent, increase the talent pool against that backdrop of what was spoken about earlier about visa barriers, cost barriers, ending the freedom of movement. So what support's needed to get the best out associate membership of Horizon?
So I think we know what the levers are, and it's about encouraging and enabling our researchers to access. Often they're quite complex, these funding schemes, so they need expert advice in accessing and developing bids and finding partners and travelling and organising events and meetings and so on. Now that all requires some money, and so that's where obviously DCID at the moment is thinking about whether there is any underspend or unallocated money which wasn't spent on Horizon Europe, which could be allocated across the university sector. If we do see that kind of grant being given out, we would obviously see Barnett consequentials, and that's where I would say we'd be absolutely delighted and really hopeful that we would see that then trickle through to universities in Scotland so that we can help revitalise those really crucial collaborations.
Okay, I hear your plea about direct funding, but in part of University of Scotland's submission, you'd highlighted that our organisation highlighted that in the last multi-year Horizon programme, Scotland brought in close to 900 million euros, boosting the innovation economy. So can we put a figure on how much money is potentially been lost out during that period where we were excluded from Horizon?
I'm not aware that we have an analysis specifically on that, but again, I'll check and I'll ask to see if we can provide some kind of estimate.
Okay. Can I just go to Dr. High, because Alliances for Research Challenges also stated that Scotland had been disproportionately impacted to the delays in the Horizon Europe negotiations and Brexit. So can you maybe elaborate on your experience in that regard?
Yeah. From the Alliance's perspective, Horizon Europe is such an important funding scheme because it enables the building of research teams. The grants have such a size that it's not just about an individual researcher doing his/her research project. It's about really building that capacity for excellence in a particular area. And so when that access was suddenly put into jeopardy, it really affected the research landscape in Scotland, because we are already, I would say, in a UK perspective, we are competing very much with the Golden Triangle. And if we are already competing, and then we then have this added insecurity of this bigger funding, we lose out.
Is that, you able to quantify on what potential income streams have been missed out on, and how long it can take to recover to get even back to where we were?
I don't know how much we have lost. I guess that kind of calculation is always difficult to make. With the alliances, we have heard it already from some of our business partners in the alliances, because they lost access where they didn't have that guarantee from the UKRI on the Pillar 3. But yeah.
Okay. Is it the case where potentially missed out already in some projects, but is it the case then that, say, European institutions that have been successful continue to participate. So they've therefore got projects that they can build on and continue to reapply for future funding streams. So therefore there's a continued catch-up that you're disadvantaged in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's me, Chair.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. And thank all of you. That was a fascinating and very invigorating start to this inquiry. I think there's a couple of things you said when we get back to this committee on which our clerks will surely chase you up on. But anything else that you feel that you could positively contribute to this inquiry, we're open for any suggestions or further input. But thank you ever so much for today. It's been really, I think you could tell by the interest that's been generated around the committee that this has really worked for a start for us in this inquiry, and we're all looking forward to continue to engage. But for today, order, order.